Hello and welcome to this lecture. And in this lecture, we are going to talk a few things about CSS selectors. So in the previous lecture, we have already learned how exactly do we link a CSS file to HTML and style a particular element using that particular element inside the CSS code, or referring that element inside the CSS code and writing some properties for that. Now, the way in which we have referred that particular element, which is the heading element inside the CSS, was we have used something which was called as an element selector. So what we have simply done here is that as h1 is our element, which is the heading element, we have simply typed in the name for h1, and we have simply referred h1 over here and assigned it a few properties like color. Now, this is one kind of element selector, or basically CSS selector, which we have used, which is called as the element selector. But there are two more types of selectors which we need to learn, and those are nothing but the ID selector and the class selector. So even before learning them, let's exactly understand why do we need something like the ID selector or the class selector. So let's actually take an example. So what I will do here is that right after this form, I'm actually going to have a paragraph here. So let's say this paragraph says something like this is para 1, and let's say we create another paragraph right below it which says this is para 2. Okay, so now once we have these two paragraphs, we can now actually go ahead and try to style them. So if we go over here and if we try to use the element selector, we have to type in P, because P is the element which we want to style, and you can type in color equals red. Now if you go back to your web page and if you hit refresh, as you could see, both of those paragraphs are red, and that's okay if you want them to be red. But let's say if you want to make these paragraphs of a different color. So these two are actually paragraphs, but when you actually use the element selector, you don't have any way to distinguish in between these two elements. So how exactly are you going to distinguish between these two elements so that you can style them individually? And the way we do that is that we assign an ID to each one of those paragraphs. So we add an ID attribute over here. So we say ID equals, and let's say we name this paragraph as P1, and let's say the ID for this paragraph is going to be equal to P2. So now we actually have a way to distinguish these two elements, and now we can style them individually. So now what we will do is that we will get rid of this P, and now while using an ID selector, you always refer to an ID by using a hash sign. So type in hash, then type in the ID name, which is P1, and then you could assign it a color. So let's say we are going to type in color, and let's assign it a color red. And now let's also get access to P2 using the ID selector. So let's give a hash, type in P2. Let's say the color over here should not be columns, that should be color. So let's say the color over here is, let's say, blue. So once we have assigned the colors, now if we actually go ahead and hit refresh, as you could see, now both of these paragraphs are of a different color. Now that we know what ID selector is and how ID selectors actually work, let's actually talk about class selectors. So now let's go ahead and go into our code. And even before talking about the class selectors, I would like to mention or specify one thing, which is actually called as the div tag. So a div tag basically means whenever you actually want to form sections on your web page, you use a div tag to do so. So it basically is like the division tag, which is going to divide your web page into different portions. So let's say if you want to group together or basically form a separate section of elements together, so what you simply do is that you create a div tag or create a div, and inside that div you can actually go ahead and place the elements. So here, in order to understand the class selector, we are actually going to make a div and assign it a class. So let's type in div. So this is the basic div here, and let's say this thing says something like this is a div element, and once we have this, we'll actually go ahead and see how this thing looks like. So let me hit refresh, and as you could see, we have our div element here, which is nothing but basically a section down right over here. Now let's say if you want to get access to this particular div element, so what you can simply do here is that you could assign the class attribute over here, and just like we have assigned ID, we have class over here, and let's say we name this class as center. So now once we have this div class equal center, what we can do now is that we could go into style.css, and in order to use the class selector, we use a dot first and then type in the div name, which is center in this case. And now you can specify any property which you want. So let's say if you want to change the color of this thing, you can simply type in color, and let's say the color of this thing is going to be aqua. Simply specify the color, go back over here, and when you hit refresh, as you could see, this element is now styled using CSS. So that's how you can go ahead and use the different types of selectors. So the two different kinds of selectors which we have learned here is the ID selector and the class selector. So in order to use an ID selector, you need to assign an ID to the HTML element, and once you have assigned the ID to the HTML element, you refer to that element inside your CSS using hash. So mention hash first, then simply type in the ID name, and then you can specify any CSS property to that particular element. Now the next kind of selector which we have learned is the class selector, and for using class selector, you first have to use a div, which basically is nothing but it actually represents its children. It can be used with a class, lang, title attributes to mark up semantics common to a group of consecutive elements. So basically the div tag is something which groups together different kinds of elements, and once you assign a class to this div, now you can actually use this class to basically use the class selector and assign some CSS properties to it. So just make sure that whenever you are referring a class inside your CSS, always make sure that the class actually starts with a dot. So that's it for this lecture. Hopefully you guys were able to understand the two different kinds of selectors. We will be using these selectors widely in the upcoming lectures as well. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.